Hey, sorry, man. I didn't have my mic plugged in. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, sounds good. Awesome. Sounds good. All right, bye.
Speaking, I am currently speaking to my audience, and I am reading a script, and then I am going to direct questions. My whole screen? Okay, that's good. Yeah, that's the point. That's the point. everyone. Welcome back to my live stream this evening. This is the Volunt Austrian, and today we're going to go over a particular topic that's pretty important to not only my economics, the field of economics that I support, which is Austrian economics, but also the philosophy which I espouse, which is voluntarism. And today we're going to talk about consent. So, as you probably saw in today's stream's title, what is consent? Today we're going to go over the most basic definition that I could possibly... I've tried to phrase it as basically as I could. I apologize if I lose anyone, but there will be I have changed the format today so that there will be plenty of time for questions and audience participation, so that hopefully I will be able to pick up some of those shortcomings from my previous more lecture-like presentations. So, what is consent? First of all, I have written about this in a blog post which you may or may not have read. I'm not sure how much exposure that got, but just to go over those results briefly, consent is a total, explicit, prior, and willing action. Those are four very important aspects of consent. Consent is total in that when you consent to something, you consent to its entirety. There isn't a part of something that you leave out. You have to completely state what you consent to, and to go along with that, consent is explicit in that when you state that you consent to something, when you leave something out, consent cannot be implicitly provided to something that if you didn't mention it, if you didn't say this is okay, then it's not okay. That's what explicit consent means. And beyond that, consent is also prior and willing, which means that consent has to occur before an action is undertaken. So, consent that occurs after an action is, at most, we could consider it forgiveness for that thing. It is not a consent. For example, if you were to tell a robber that it was okay that he broke into your house after he had already broken into your house and robbed you, it would be at best forgiveness. It would not be the consent for him to remove all of your belongings from your house. And most of all, most importantly, consent is willing. Consent cannot be forced. That's probably the aspect of it that's most obvious to people when you talk about consent. Consent cannot be coerced or threatened out of someone. It's not really consent when that happens, and we all intuitively know that about consent, that consent cannot coexist with force. If you are being forced to do something, you don't consent. And if you consent, you are not being forced. Those are diametrically opposed to one another, and that's what most people consider to be what consent means. So, consent is given prior to an action, limited to that action and nothing else, and in the absence of force or the threat thereof. Consent is often given in either explicit phrases like, yes, that's okay, yes, you may do that, I'm okay with that, that's alright, but it can also be in actions as well, like signing a contract that has been, obviously that you've reviewed, you're informed about it. You can't consent if you don't even know what you're consenting to. That doesn't really count. It couldn't possibly be explicit if you didn't know what it was you were explicitly referring to. So signing a contract, or it could be something a little bit less verbal, but nonetheless explicit. In that, for example, you could, when someone comes to your door, you could open it and gesture them inside. That would be an example of a non-verbal but explicit consent. allowing them into your home or into some other space that you would be in charge of. In most social situations, the boundaries of consent only have to be implicit, because the people who interact are usually brought up in a somewhat similar way, and they understand each other's boundaries without having to really state. For example, personal space is something we all consider on a regular basis. We don't go up to each other and stand 3 inches away from each other's faces and talk. We have this amount of distance. I mean, especially nowadays, people are super conscious about how far away they are from other people, and that's for unrelated reasons. But nonetheless, even before people were hyper aware of diseases, personal space was still a known thing, and in that case it's really more of an implicit rather than an explicit consent. But consent as it concerns property, I mean to distinguish consent in that regard, that it was okay that he did it, versus consent regarding people's bodies, people's property, that I want to talk about today, that's important to economics and philosophy. Where consent concerns property, which in reality property is simply the allocation of scarce resources, we need to be more specific about what consent means. We have to have more specific delineations so as to avoid conflict. In social situations, most of the time you are permitted to leave at any point that you want. You only participate voluntarily in a social interaction, and so those boundaries are more fuzzy. But where they concern property, where scarce resources are involved, we have to be specific. We can't afford to be fuzzy, because we have the institution of property in order to avoid potentially violent conflict, if not just argument, but also the potential for violence between people, and that would be what everyone would default to, violently acquiring what they thought was theirs, if we didn't have some sort of delineation to say, this is mine, this is yours, and we don't have to fight then to find out that boundary. We already have it there. And that's the importance of property in a society. But is there a way, and that's part of the question that I want to explore tonight, is there a way that property can be delineated that doesn't involve subjective determinations, that doesn't require people to come together and say, this is mine, this is yours? If I were able to look at you from a distance and see you doing something, there was some method of acquiring or naming property that I could see you had already done, and I didn't have to ask you, if I could objectively determine what was yours and what was not yours, that would be obviously very useful in a society, so that everyone wouldn't have to constantly be in communication. Is this really his? Is he just claiming it? Is it someone else's? Having an objective standard of property would be even more useful than just a standard of property in general. And so that's part of the question I want to explore tonight. Clearly, these delineations can't simply be made arbitrarily. That's part of the subjective idea of property. We can't simply arbitrarily, I couldn't say everything in the world is mine and nothing else is anyone else's, or I couldn't say everything within 5 feet of me or 6 meters of me is mine and nothing else and everything else is someone else's. I could define an infinite number of such standards, and it would be arbitrary, and it would be completely useless to society, as we would have no way of agreeing between individuals on which one of these infinite standards to use. And since the resources they govern are useful in our daily lives, since they govern things like land and food and water and labor, the lack of an agreement, again, leads to violence. It leads to the alternative besides an institution of property, which is violence. And so when these decisions of what is whose property have a material effect on human survival and prosperity, we have to seek a principle, something that can be objectively known to human reason, and in a way that we can proceed from logical deduction what these delineations should be, so that everyone can agree, or at least everyone who is being logically consistent can agree on whose property is whose, and then we can avoid violence entirely if we were only to resort to property. So in the natural state, before property enters the equation, in the natural state, nothing is owned. In fact, there isn't a notion of ownership in this natural state. We have to develop one that can be objective. Many religions, many philosophies have their own definitions of property, but tonight we need to develop an objective one, because ultimately, unless one could logically prove that one of these, from an objective fact that one of these religions or philosophies was true, and that knowledge could disseminate throughout the entire society, if everyone believed it, then we could just use that standard of property and that would be okay. But an objective standard of property that everyone can agree on regardless of their religion, regardless of their philosophy, apart from a few basic propositions about the world, if we can have one of those, then we can have social cohesion even when people don't necessarily believe exactly the same things. So in the natural state, nothing is owned, and we haven't yet developed a concept of ownership. Everything at this stage is equally available to anyone's use. So anything you have the power to do, you can do it. There's no notion of ownership or law or rules that would prevent you from doing anything you wanted to do. It would be total chaos. Most people use the term anarchy to describe this state of affairs, but as we will see later, anarchy is better described in a slightly different way than absolute chaos, or at least that's what I hope to be able to explain. So the only thing that is not infinitely available, even if we lived in the Garden of Eden, even if every material good was limitlessly and instantly available to every human being, which would be totally impossible, but even if we conceded that material goods had absolutely zero use as having an institution of property, there is still one resource that is not accessible to everyone at the same time. And that is the control of human bodies, the neurological control of human bodies. So I, as a human person, as a mind, have the ability to control my body. And you have the ability to control your body. But I can't control yours, and you can't control mine. So even if we all lived in this perfect paradise state, there is still scarce resources we have to account for, which is the ownership or the property of each individual's bodies. I can control my own, and you can control yours. Only you possess the control of your body, and only you decide how you control your body. And so that is a scarce resource that I cannot possess. Therefore, we could see that even in this Garden of Eden situation, there is a potential for conflict over this scarce resource. And what we normally would call what we've been calling up to this point bodily control, we would normally call labor. The ability to control one's own body in order to do something productive. So in order to avoid conflict, even in the Garden of Eden, we have to have a standard of property over human labor. And recall also from earlier that we are seeking an allocation of this ownership that is not arbitrary. It has to be something that is knowable via human reason that can be deduced, rather than something that is just made up. For example, there are a few logical possibilities we could consider when we were looking for such a standard of ownership of human bodies. For example, option 1, we could remain in the natural state for the most part, but state that everyone owns everyone. Now, if everyone owns everyone, that's what most people know as communism. Now, communism is it essentially posits that every person in the world is owned by and is owner of everyone else, at least in some very small portion, just enough so that all 7 billion people on the earth are entitled to control all 7 billion other people on the earth. But notice the problem that immediately comes to the forefront when we suggest that everyone owns everyone. If everyone has the right to control everyone else, then everyone has to come to an agreement before anyone can do anything. Because if all 7 billion people have control over me, then for me to do anything, I have to get permission of all of those 7 billion people. And if I have control over all those 7 billion people, all of those 7 billion people have to get permission from me. And so immediately this sort of standard, even though it's universal, it treats everyone equally, and therefore it's not arbitrary in that sense, it immediately falls apart in practice. There's no possible way that I could communicate with every 7 billion people, all the 7 billion people on Earth, before I consume my next bit of oxygen. So communism immediately fails from the outset. It's simply an impossible standard of property because people are not a hive mind, and they cannot effortlessly communicate with everyone else in the human race. So the second option that we have is hegemony. Now, hegemony is essentially this. One person, or a group of people, a finite group of people, owns everyone. And it's still a logical possibility, but it's difficult to see how this allocation wouldn't be done without arbitrariness. Now, keep in mind that communism, effectively, I would only be able to communicate with a finite number of people before doing anything. And so if I'm only communicating with a finite number of people, then effectively only those people have ownership of me, which means communism in practice devolves into hegemony, where a small subset of people own me. But it's not just me, it's also those people. It's still a logical possibility, but it's difficult to see how it would be done in a way that is objective, that doesn't involve arbitrariness. At least the first possibility, the theoretical world communism, treats everyone absolutely equally, so as to eliminate any arbitrary decisions. But who would receive this title of owner of me under hegemony? How many people should own me? Would it just be one person? Would it be 5? Would it be 1 million? And what criterion, if any, could possibly objectively differentiate between ruler and ruled? Some people, like for example, a racist would probably tell you that white people should own all black people, or maybe a dictator would tell you that he should own everyone, someone who has world domination aspirations, or maybe a technocrat or a scientist would tell you that all of the intelligent people should own everyone else, or maybe there's an infinite number of such property distinctions that anyone could invent, and in practice we see that most of them are actually are self-serving. People want to put themselves in the ruler position rather than the ruled, and that's only understandable. But is there any criterion that is so unassailable and so unquestionably obvious that a divide could cleanly and objectively be made between the ruling class and the ruled? Again, I could invent an infinite number of them. Obviously, that is simply untrue. No one can possibly invent an objective standard under hegemony. So hegemony is also out of the question. So that leaves one possibility. And that is that everyone owns only himself, which I here have called capitalism. Capitalism is the only standard that is left. If more than one person who is outside of me owns me, then that's hegemony. If everyone owns me, then that's communism. Communism eventually reduces to hegemony, so I either have the option of owning myself, or if I don't own myself, then I'm under hegemony. And hegemony simply is arbitrary. It doesn't work. It isn't subject to human reason. So self-ownership is really the only reasonable option. So if we were to look into the possibility that each person owned only himself, we could, and here's the kicker, we could successfully make a delineation in a way that is obvious and easily accessible by human reason. And this is really miraculous when you think about it. But in fact, there is a direct neurological connection, basically right here, between the mind that is controlling my body and the body that is being controlled. And that the same is true for everyone, all 7 billion people on the planet. We have never succeeded in separating a mind from its body, or a body from it. Well, actually, we've succeeded many times in separating a body from its mind, but not in a functional way. So this connection is here to stay, and it's obvious on everyone whose mind is controlling whose body. Even to newborn children, it is obvious, immediately obvious, that other people are separate from itself. A baby smiles at its parents. It cries to its parents. It asks them for food and for comfort, because it intuitively understands, even as knowing nothing else about the world, it understands that its parents are a separate entity from itself, capable of making their own decisions that may or may not be in the immediate interest of the child. So even newborn children recognize self-ownership as the only possible standard of property. So, if that is the case, then what are the corollaries of self-ownership? How does that affect the our day-to-day lives if we were to all own ourselves, if that was the only possible way that ownership could be worked out? First of all, we can deduce that an individual owns his life. He owns the integrity of his body. No other person may take his life or threaten his life, since to do so would be to attempt to physically control his body. And as we've already established, ownership of physical ownership of the body can be given only to the person whose mind is connected to it. So to take someone's life would be to violate the ownership of their body. Secondly, an individual owns his liberty or freedom to do whatever he has the power to do, which does not violate another individual's life or liberty. Liberty outflows from an individual's life, since the only way you could control someone else's actions would be to threaten their life. At this point, it also applies to property, but we haven't gotten to property yet. The only way to control someone else's liberty is to threaten their life, and we've already established that goes against self-ownership. So liberty outflows from life. And finally, an individual owns his property, those physical objects which he physically transforms from an unowned state, in the natural state, remember, into his own use, or acquires them from another individual voluntarily, or in accordance with their consent, by gift or trade. Now, a person brings things from an unowned natural state into his own use by use of his liberty. And this acquisition of property can only occur voluntarily, because if it did not, it would be inconsistent with the other individual's right to liberty. It exists in the state that it does due to the exercise of his liberty at some point in the past. So he takes something from an unowned state, transforms it, does labor to it, and then in the future it now becomes his property. But in order to violate his property, in order to steal, as we call it, you would have to violate his liberty in the past, which is effectively to enslave him. We call a violation of liberty, we call that slavery, and of course we call a violation of his life either assault or murder. So this conclusion, this institution of property, now gives us the ability to leave Eden. In other words, when we lived in the Garden of Eden, we didn't have to care about other scarce resources. Now that we have property, we can, in fact, address those things. Other things in the world besides human labor are obviously scarce. But property can solve that problem of their allocation, and as we have seen, it is the only way that such a problem can reasonably be solved in a way that's accessible to human reason, since it is the logical result of the only reasonable allocation of labor. That is why consent is so important. That's what consent is, and that's why it's so important. Because without consent, it is not possible to voluntarily trade with other human beings. It is the foundation of all human endeavors and all society. And all human endeavors are founded in property, which are founded in liberty, life, and ultimately the ethic of self-ownership. So with that, the scripted portion of this ends, and I was hoping to direct some questions to the audience. So, let's consider this situation. Person A goes up to person B, holds a sharp object to his up to some vulnerable part of his body, and says, "Give me your wallet." Is this relationship consensual? I'm going to start with a low ball, but is this relationship respecting of consent? Of course, these problems are going to get these questions are going to get a little bit more insightful, I think, or at least inquisitive. The insight is really, I want to come from the audience rather than myself. I have some ideas about how I hope you'll respond, but in this case, I want you to be the ones seeing this, and not me just speaking it to you. So, do we have any yes or no's from the audience? Okay, well, let's talk through that one. Obviously, no. If the sharp object was required, if person B thought that person A would not be convinced without the sharp object, then obviously he's violating person A's consent over his body, and so this relationship is obviously not consensual. Now, let's go to question number 2. If person A goes to person B and says, I will mow your lawn if you pay me $10, and the two of them agree, is this relationship consensual? And I think also, again, this should be pretty easy. I almost used the word in the definition here. We'll just wait for a yes or a no answer in the chat. And you'll notice also that I wore my capitalism shirt again, but that's because really that's the only possible. It says, I don't know if you can see in the small letters, but it says enjoy capitalism. It's a reference to the Coca-Cola logo, obviously. Okay, so we did get a response from the audience. Yes, this relationship is consensual, and that. So you get the idea. I use the word agree at the end of the sentence if the two of them agree. So agreement and consent are essentially synonyms, and so situations where people agree on something are consensual, on a trade of, in this case it was labor, mowing the lawn, for $10, for some money. A physical good. Now, let's get a little bit more insightful. Or I'll try to make this a little bit more insightful. If the robber from the first question were, instead of simply sticking the sharp object straight up to person A, what if he were to mow person A's lawn free of charge? Assume that he knew that person A wanted to mow his lawn, and so he would have been okay with it. He would if the lawn was mowed, he wouldn't be upset. But if he mowed his lawn and then stuck the sharp object up to him again and said, "Pay me $10 like you did the other guy," would this relationship be consensual? And we will wait for another yes or no answer. So as I was saying about my shirt, the enjoy capitalism, capitalism is really, as we've seen, the only reasonable, the only standard of property that is accessible to human reason. So that's, you have to enjoy it, or that's all you really get. That's the only reasonable alternative to anything else. We did get an answer, and the answer is obviously no. So the difference between the second question and the third question was person A and B agreed first, and then the services were rendered and it was exchanged. There was the exchange of goods. But after, in question 3, the first good was provided, the mowing of the lawn was provided, and then person B went to person A, stuck him up, and said, "Pay me $10. Now, obviously, that's not consensual, even though he provided the good beforehand. So, if he didn't ask person A's permission, the relationship still isn't consensual, and it violates self-ownership, even though the goods were provided. So, this is really the question that I've wanted to I've wanted to ask, where I've been going with all of this. So, if an agent of the government were to, for example, let's say the military, they go out and they fight either a war on our shores or a foreign war against people who they say will aggress against you at some point in the future. And they fight, and some of them get hurt or are killed. They do all of these things, and then they come back home and they say, we did a good service to you, so we're going to ask you to pay us. But if you don't pay us, then we're going to stick you up. We're either going to put you in jail, or we're going to, if you resist that, we're going to shoot you. Now, is that relationship consensual? And I'm going to wait for a yes or a no answer again. The audience is saying he's going 2 for 2. There's a particular member of the audience who's going 2 for 2, and I applaud you for your attention in this presentation, because you so far have perfect marks. Let's see how you deal with this relationship. Did I hear a no? That is correct. Again, the answer is no. If the government, even if it's the government, if the government provides a service or a good, and then comes and asks for your permission, and asks to be paid before they ask your permission, then even if they're the government, even if they have amassed for themselves some form of apparent importance, or some title, or some respect from other members of the population, or maybe a large number of guns and people to wield them, or a majority of the population of the people who live in your area, or any other number of things. All of those things are irrelevant. So a democratic vote is irrelevant. If they manage to conquer your village or your city, that's irrelevant. If they claimed your property before you actually worked to transform it, if they verbally claim it, for example, as they do now with the boundaries of the United States, they have not really worked that land in order to transform it and take it into their own ownership, but nevertheless they claim a title to the land, because how else could they charge things like property taxes or any other kind of tax, really? If they didn't really own, if they don't really own you, if they don't really own the land, if they don't really own your property, how on earth could they charge you a fee to use it? Now, of course, they will try to justify that in that they provide you services like roads, taxes, roads, military, schools, courts, any number of things. But those things really don't matter, as we've seen. Those are not a justification for charging you money without your explicit prior permission. So, and now I'm going to get back to the anarchy comment that I made earlier. I mean to call anarchy as something different than absolute chaos. Anarchy, if you look at the Greek format of the word, an meaning no, and archy meaning rulers, it doesn't mean no rules. It means no rulers. So this government that is attempting to charge you taxes is effectively acting as your ruler. Obviously, that's what we mean when we say ruler, is someone who we probably think of taxes, we probably think of the law, we probably think of any other number of things that rulers do historically. But none of the things that they do matters if they don't get your explicit prior consent. Now, ask yourself, has the government ever asked for explicit prior consent for the services they have rendered? For example, have they ever sent a letter to your door asking if you'd like to pay for foreign wars? Asking if you'd like to pay in order to be forced to use the dying fiat currency that they have foisted upon the population? Have you ever been asked if the roads that you pay for are actually up to snuff that you use? Have you ever been asked if the schools or the civic, the government meetings, the waste disposal, any other service that they provide, have they ever asked you to pay before they actually did the service? And the answer is obviously no. No one has ever gone out and done those things. The consent that is provided is implicit, which means that the government, seeing your lack of action in response to the provision of those things, just took that as a sign that it was okay to continue charging you taxes. We did get a comment from the chat, if we could read that off. Okay. The government asking everyone permission is physically impossible. First of all, I can say that that's hogwash, because they send everyone a bill. If they can send everyone a bill, they can send everyone a yes or no, opt-in, opt-out letter. Well, actually, they don't send everyone a bill, because lots of people are of adult age who use the services but don't actually pay taxes. There are lots of people who are off the books. But yes, they can, and again, just like any other company, how many subscription services do you use? That's essentially what the government styles itself as a subscription service. You pay every year, probably April 15th. Most of you file your taxes on April 15th, and then for the rest of the year, the services are rendered to you, and then you pay again April 15th, and so on and so forth. It's a subscription service, or that's what they style themselves as. So if it's a subscription service, then why have they can simply ask, do you opt in or do you opt out? If you opt out, then just like any other subscription service, the only thing they can do is leave you alone with your own property, which includes your land, which is essentially what we call secession. If you say no to the government and they leave you alone, then you become, in a sense, a nation unto yourself, and anyone else who wants to associate with you, really. And so that you become sovereign unto yourself. No one else is sovereign over you. That's what secession means. And so, yes, the government actually can ask permission of everyone, and if they don't, then that's their responsibility for violating. They have transitioned from capitalism into hegemony, which, as we've seen, is arbitrary and ultimately unreasonable. We did get a further comment. Again, they can't do that for every decision they make, but they can, because we see that, for example, everyone is encouraged to vote on propositions, on candidates that are elected. They can actually ask everyone's opinion. My own opinion on democracy is that voting does not equal consent, because voting in the system that you've already been subjected to is not prior. You're already in the system and then you vote. It's not a prior thing, so it can't possibly meet the definition of consent. But in fact, they do attempt to ask permission for at least some of the decisions that they make. And in order to do that, they have to send out votes. They have to send out ballots. And so, yes, they can actually ask permission, even if it's not to every minute decision. They can at least ask your permission to subscribe. For example, nobody asks when you subscribe to like DoorDash or some other service. Nobody asks you if you'd like your food cooked to this exact temperature across all of your DoorDash orders. They just say, "Would you like to use our services?" and yes or no. And there's a list of the services that they provide, and then you say yes or you say no. That's really the only thing they have to do. They don't have to say, they don't have to micromanage all of their decisions, but there is at least that one aspect of consent that is required under capitalism. In order to claim capitalism as the system of property you're using, you do have to acquire consent. And if you don't, it's hegemony or communism, which are both unreasonable. Do we have any further comments? Alright, let's see if we have any further questions. I'm going to give it about another 30 seconds. And if we don't get any further questions, then this one will kind of be a short one tonight. But we did kind of get to the point that I was trying to make. And so, anarchy, maybe we'll talk about this next time, that anarchy is not chaos. But in effect, capitalism is anarchy. Capitalism is total self-ownership in the sense that no one else has a hegemonic rule over what you say and what you do. Well, maybe over what you say, depending on if you're on their property, but that's not really hegemonic because you're already on their property. You've already made some kind of an agreement with them. So capitalism, effectively, self-ownership equates to anarchy, and we'll talk about that next time. Anarchy is not chaos. That's why I describe myself not only as a voluntarist, but also as an anarcho-capitalist, because I want to differentiate myself from an anarcho-communist who believes that communism is the result of anarchy, which we've already shown to be impossible and unreasonable. But as opposed to an anarcho-communist, I am an anarcho-capitalist, which means capitalism is the result of anarchy, and I advocate both anarchy and capitalism. So if we didn't get any other questions in that amount of time, then we'll go ahead and end it here. Go ahead and mull over those questions throughout the week. Is the government really asking my permission before they provide me services? And if not, why don't they respect my consent? Ask yourself those questions, and we'll be back next week at Saturday at 8 p.m. right here. This has been the Volant Austrian, and have a good week. Absolutely think about those questions, and I will see you later.